That is going to bring us to Ecclesiastes chapter 3, which is where we're starting. So you guys can open up your Bible to that. And I did the most obvious thing by playing the birds just to set the stage for that chapter, right? Because it is, as Ken said, written by God or written by the teacher. So there it is, the song that most people have heard. It's kind of like continued to stay relevant in time. And that's because the message is beautiful, right? There's a season and a time for everything. It's a great thought, right? And that's why I think it's continued to be such a popular song. But what I want to talk tonight about is just the idea of time itself and how we're kind of trapped in time. And in that, we have eternity in our hearts. And we might remember, just because it's been a week, that we've been discussing the word habel and breath, and since we met the last time, I did the math before I got up here, that's 308 breaths since we've gotten together last. 154,000 breaths during a week, and we've had 2 weeks since we've gone through here. So what did you accomplish? What did you do with the last 308 breaths? And if you took those 308 breaths, did you have anything in them that transcends the moment itself, something that you're storing up treasure for heaven? What have you done with your 2 weeks that really mattered, that had any gain, any profit? And the pessimistic teacher kind of comes to this idea that it's all meaningless, right? It's like chasing after the wind. You're trying to catch something that you can't grasp. And that's like God too, right? Like just because you can't grasp the wind doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And just because you can't, see God doesn't mean that he doesn't exist. And time is another one of those things. Because there, if you look at verse 1, it says, there is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the sun. Time is another one of those things that we try to grasp, but we can't, right? But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. In fact, in the book Confessions, Augustine said, I know what time is, but when someone asks me what it is, I have a hard time explaining it, right? Like I don't know how to explain it. And that's time, right? We have this intuition that time is passing, but how do you describe that? All we could do is look back and see that it has passed, right? For me, I start to think of my children, and my son was born on July 31st of 2001, and he is 21 years old now, right? Now, just think about that. A child born in the 2000s is in their 20s. That makes you realize that time passes, doesn't it? And you have to look back at it to see how fast it's going, but you can reach out to try to grab it and slow it down, and you just can't. In fact, I would love to go back to a time where my son was like tiny and cute, right? Now he's not so tiny and cute. I would probably wish I could go back and do some things different as a parent, but I can't, right? Maybe you have those regrets in your life too, things that you wish you could have just done differently. If I just could go back in time, but we're waiting for somebody to create that time machine where we can go back to the 90s or the 80s or wherever you want to go back to and just, do that thing over again. But you can't, because there is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the sun. Time is one of those things that we intuitively know it's passing. We can't really explain what it is, but gosh, does it just fly by, right? Like that's time. You look back at your life and it's just a vapor. It's there for a second and then it's gone. And so the teacher, remember Ecclesiastes means one who presents before an assembly, like a preacher or a teacher. And as a preacher, he's going to give us a poem, right, to tell us about what it is to be trapped in time. And I think the reason this poem often gets misunderstood is because we forget the perspective that the teacher is talking to us through, right? He's saying there's a time for everything, a season for every activity under the heavens, which is just a new way, but the same as under the sun. He's still saying, look, there's a time for every activity under the sun. And that's true, right? And since it's such a beautiful poem, we think, wow, that's really great. But this isn't great news for the teacher. In fact, at the end of the poem, I'm going to get to the end before I get to the beginning. Look at verse 9. He asks the question once the poem's over. He says, what do workers gain from their toil? Right? So in spite of the fact that there's a time and a season for everything, what reward is there when time is up? And it's a rhetorical question. The answer that he wants us to say is, well, there's nothing. There's a time for everything, but once time runs out, it's gone, right? So there we are, and he gives us this poem, and I want to go through the poem. The poem has 14 different parallel things, right? Just look at the verse 1 and verse 2, a time to be born and a time to die. And that's going to be parallel to the rest of verse 2, which is a time to plant and a time to uproot. Now, these parallel things are just times in life, right? It's not like he's saying these are good things or bad things. These are just things that we all experience in life. And then even if you think that, well, this list here in this poem isn't going to make up all the times in people's lives. In fact, what it's really meant to do is describe in both literal or metaphoric ways that different periods in people's lives, like the life cycle, different emotions, times for war and peace or personal relationships, times to embrace and friendships, and those kind of things. There's a time for all of those things. He's not giving us some kind of list of these are all the times. In fact, I've never really had a time to throw stones or take them away, which we're going to see in a little bit. And a time to plant and a time to uproot could also be metaphoric, right? Like we put our roots down someplace and then we pull them up and take it someplace else, right? Those are just describing times in life. And so there are various times. Now look at this. We'll go through them real quick. The first times describe life cycles, right? Verse 2 and verse 3. Life cycles. It says a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant, a time to uproot, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to tear down, and a time to build. See, these are all things we don't have any control over. You have your life is just a vapor. It's there for a second and then it's gone. Or perhaps we want to quote what the writer of Hebrews says, where it says it's destined for every man to die once, and then after that face judgment. See, there is a time to be born and there is a time to die. We have no control. No matter how much we try to control, we have no control over those times. Just the same is true in the plant world. There is a time that you're supposed to plant and a time that you're supposed to uproot. These are just different seasons. In fact, if I go look in my backyard, and I was looking in my backyard this week quite a bit as I wrote this, because if somebody said a couple weeks ago it's fall and my trees caught on to the idea, right? They just knew. And so my tree that used to be green in the backyard, I was looking at it, and the edges of all the leaves on the tree are starting to turn red. And then I got a little more interested because I was thinking about seasons, and I went out and looked at the tree, and at the top of the tree, it's almost all completely red. And I don't even know when that happened. I've been in my house all week, and it just happened. It's like the tree itself knew that it was time. And so what we really are trying to understand is, if we're in this time, how do we live responsibly in this time? Right? Like a farmer should know the good time to plant the seed, and he goes out and digs the soil and puts the seed down so that it is ready to be harvested in the right time. Now, a farmer could go out and plant in the winter and harvest in like the summer, or just pick different seasons. You could try that, but it's just going to work out to your ruin, right? It's just going to mess things up, because you have to know the time and live responsibly within the time that you have. So there's a time to plant and a time to uproot. And this is just different times in life. There's a time to kill and a time to heal. And now many authors will go so far out of their way to say, well, the Bible actually is okay with some of these things, right? I mean, the Bible talks about times to kill. Self-defense would be one of those reasons. With the people of Israel going through the desert, God had a law for them that they had the death penalty. That would be a time to kill and time to heal. But the point of the author is not to say these are good things and these are bad things, but just simply that these are parts of life. And we all have to go through those different parts of life, whether they're literal or metaphoric. There are times to build structures in your life, and there are times to tear those structures down and start over. Right? And maybe I can't be alone in this, but I've gone through some of those building and tearing down processes in my own life, and sometimes in my own faith. Like I am not the same kind of Christian I was when I first became a Christian. I've torn down some things that I shouldn't have built up in the first place, and I've had to rebuild. But there's a time for that. That's the life cycle. There's a time for that. But there's also times for emotions. Look at this. It says, there's a time to weep. This is verse 4. A time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn, and a time to dance. These are emotions, right? Not just said like specifically weeping and laughing. There's those times, but also like the outward expression of those times. You can dance or you can mourn. And you know what's interesting about these times? You ever notice how these times seem to make time slow down? Like those times of weeping and mourning, they go on forever. And those times of laughter and dancing, they seem to just go away. I mean, for me, a time of weeping and mourning was 2020, right? Like that was the year that just wouldn't stop, right? Did anybody else seem like that was the longest year they've ever gone through? You had like a pandemic and social chaos, and everybody's arguing about how you're supposed to respond to that. And it's like, man, I just wish this month would end. I wish this week would end. I wish this year would end. And it's because those times, we have no control over them. All we can do is act responsibly through them. And so those times slow down. So there's the life cycle. There's also emotions. There's times for that. But there's also times for thinking about your relationships. There's a time to scatter stones and a time to gather stones. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. The practice of spreading stones and gathering stones has to do with how when you went to war, you would destroy somebody's field by casting stones onto the field, right? I'll actually read something just to show what this looks like. In 2 Kings chapter 3, verse 25, it says this. It says, they destroyed the towns, and each man threw stones on every good field until it was covered. They stopped up all the springs and cut down every good tree. Why would they do that? Well, they wanted to make it hard for that group or that community to ever be able to be productive again. And yeah, you could clear the stones out of your field eventually, but you would probably lose an entire season. And in that time, that would have been something that could ruin an entire community, to lose a season's crops. And so the act of scattering stones had to do with that, whereas the act of pulling and stacking them up has to do with clearing a field so that you could harvest, right? So that you could plant. Like Isaiah sings of God's field, and he says, I moved all the stones and I planted the choicest of vines, right? He cleared the field so that it could be productive. Stones could also have to do with boundaries, embracing a field maybe, to demonstrate your area versus your neighbor's area. And so there's a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. The point is there's a time for every activity, even your possessions. In verse 6, a time to search and a time to give up searching, a time to keep and a time to throw away. Anybody need help trying to figure out when it's time to keep and throw away? I used to work at 1-800-GOT-JUNK, and I loved working there, right? It was one of my favorite jobs because I'd get to meet people and I would see all the stuff that they were throwing away in their house, and I just liked it. Sometimes trash was just trash, and then the job wasn't so fun. But I replaced my backyard barbecue once a month for a year, right? And then I realized I'm just doing all this extra work for just these little slight upgrades. And then one time I looked back and thought, oh, I already had that barbecue, but I got rid of it. Patio sets were a problem for me, right? I would bring one home, only find a better one the next week and have to go and switch them out and a better one the next week. There's a time to keep and a time to throw away, right? The worst mistake I made working at this job was the baby grand piano that sit in my living room for 2 years with broken keys. And I knew I was going to get it fixed and tuned, and I ended up giving it over to Tom Lloyd without ever playing a note on it. But it took up most of my living room for 2 years. Isn't it so difficult to find, like, it's time to give something up? And not just your possessions, but like other things too. Like in life, there are times where you have to just give something up because it's not good for you anymore. I mean, I think one day we'll look back and we'll wonder, how much of my breath did I waste holding on to something that wasn't good for me? Right? And that's where we're at. There's a time for everything under the heavens. A time for mourning, see, a time to tear and a time to mend. This is verse 7. A time to be silent and a time to speak. They would tear their clothes when they were mourning. Maybe you could think of Job, right? And Job was somebody who went through an intense time of suffering. And he found himself sitting on a dump heap. And his wife said, give up your integrity. Just curse God and die. His friends came out, and when they saw Job, they tore their clothes because they recognized his suffering, and they didn't speak for 7 days. Isn't it like that? There is a time for great sorrow in life. And it's okay to sit in that. It's okay to be sorrowful for a moment and take that time. Because the promise is, just as there's a time to mend, there's going to be a time to sew back together. Just as there's a time to be silent, there's also going to be a time to speak. Whatever it is that you're going through, you are going to go through that time, and then a new time is coming. And that's important. You might have to sit in sorrow for a minute like Job, but a new time is coming. The last one is public relations, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. And then he ends the poem by just saying, what do people gain from all of their toil? Right? When you look at time, all the good times, the time to be born, the time to plant, the time to love and heal, and the time to have peace, those are great times. And then you look at all the bad times, a time to kill, a time for war, a time to tear down, a time to scatter stones. And you think, those are bad times. And we go through both in our life. You have no control over it. The only thing you can do is act responsibly in the time that you're in. And even then, from the perspective of under the heavens or under the sun, from a humanistic or atheist perspective, once time runs out, that's it anyways. And it's up. And what profit is there? What gain is there? What did you accomplish in life that's going to transcend your death? And the answer, well, if you're looking only under the heavens, the answer is nothing. There is nothing. And by the way, we are a people that are trapped in time. And that's why, even though I didn't say it, my first point was to be trapped in time is hard. See, we might think that these are appointed times that God has set out for us. And he does. He manages the seasons. But God didn't want there to be a time to kill. God did not want there to be a time of war. God did not want there to be hate. This is an effect of the fall. And because we are affected by the fall, we are trapped in time. And you know what? We have a God who sent his son to go to the cross and remove that barrier. Through the cross, he freed us from time. Because we have eternity in our hearts. Isn't that great? Isn't that something we should look forward to? Even though we're trapped in these seasons, and sometimes those seasons are hard, we can be comforted by the fact that better times might be coming, but we also can be comforted by the fact that we have a Savior who endured the cross to release us from the shackles of sin and take us out of the trap of time and bring us into eternity. And that's what I look forward to. Right? So there's a time for to be trapped in time. It's difficult, right? It's hard. But we have a hope that transcends time. My second point is that people live with eternity in their heart. See, the teacher asked the question, given the poem, right? There's a time for everything. Given the poem, he asked the question, what do you gain in all of this? What do workers gain from all of their toil? Well, in verse 10, he says this, I have seen the burden God has laid on the human race. He has made everything beautiful in its time, and he has set eternity in the heart, in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. That's for him, that's the problem. For us, that's the solution. Doesn't that feel like that's a burden of humanity? Right? Like we know. We might be the only creature on the planet that know that we were meant for more, that we're meant for something that transcends time, that we have eternity placed in our heart. And so when we see these things happening, we know that they look beautiful in their time, but we were meant. We have aching in our heart a belief that we were meant to transcend it. I mean, as a people, we feel like we have a shared history, right? We didn't go through Egypt or through the Dead Sea with the people of Israel, but we feel like we're shared in that history, right? We didn't witness Jesus die on the cross, but we feel like we're shared in that history. That's a part of who we are, right? And we also believe in a future hope, and that's us. We have eternity in our heart, even when we're trapped in time. The teacher, I think, the writer of Ecclesiastes is frustrated with this. I think he's frustrated at being trapped in time while knowing that eternity is, like, believing that there might be eternity in his heart and not being able to grasp it. That's what's frustrating about it, right? Because time is that thing that we know that is there. We can't explain what it is, but we can't grasp it. But eternity is also the same. We know that we were meant for eternal things, but we can't quite grasp them. Now, Jesus gives us some answers, right? He shows us a way that transcends time. But the teacher has another seize the day passage, or Carpe Diem in verse 12, where he says, I know that there is nothing better for people to do than to be happy and do good while they live, that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in their toil. This is a gift from God. And maybe that verse is just a glimpse into something that transcends the sun. Maybe that's what that verse is meant to do. I think this verse is the best possible option if you only think like somebody who only values the physical. If you think like a humanist or somebody who only believes in what's under the heavens, then the best possible option, since you can't understand eternity, is to make the most out of the day. But see, I think Jesus has shown us a different way. Jesus has shown us that we can glimpse and grasp at eternity because he defeated time in his death and resurrection. And though we're trapped in it, one day we'll be set free from it. We have eternity in our hearts. But in verse 14, it says this, I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added and nothing can be taken from it. God does this so that we will fear him. Isn't that an interesting thought, that God gives us eternity but doesn't allow us to grasp it, to remind us of how great he is, of how amazing he is to have a God that transcends time itself. We don't completely understand it, but God does. And so verse 15 says, whatever is has been already, and whatever has been will be before, and God will call the past into account. See, when we consider the greatness of God, it should cause us to fear him. It should cause us to revere him. And that's a good place for faith to start, because faith begins with the fear of the Lord, right? That's the beginning of knowledge. My third point is injustice makes time slow down, right? So the way that this has progressed is Solomon has stood up and given us a poem about time and said, we're trapped in this time, and what do you gain in the end of it? When time runs out, is there anything that transcends? And that frustrates him because he can recognize that in his heart he wants eternity, but he can't grasp it. And he says, God does this so that we fear him. And that's good, because the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. But there is one more thing that's so frustrating for him. It's that he looks in a world trapped in time and he sees injustice. So look at me with verse 16, where it says this, and I saw something else under the sun. Again, perspective. He's looking ground level. I saw something else under the sun. In the place of judgment, wickedness was there, and in the place of justice, wickedness was there. Isn't that part of the problem of being stuck in time? Is the place where fairness and justice is supposed to be lived out, instead we see wickedness. This is interesting, because Solomon would have been a king who it was his job to administer justice. So the fact that he wrote this is one of those hiccups in the book. What's going on here? He's the king. He's the one who's supposed to be in charge of justice, and yet he's complaining that justice is hard to come by, and a lot of times we see wickedness instead. But the place where people would go to find justice was also the city gate. And they would walk through that city gate, and that's where business would be conducted, and that's where covenants would be made. You might think of Ruth, right? The book of Ruth, where Boaz, does this whole deal over a sandal at the city gate. We don't understand that stuff in our time, but it happened in theirs. And what's frustrating the teacher is that there's supposed to be justice in the world. There's supposed to be fairness in the world. And yet we look at a world trapped in time and we realize there's a time to kill, a time for war, a time for hate. And it frustrates us. I mean, you don't have to go back very far. Just look at the last 100 years. In the whole span of time, that's not very far, is it? Yet we've had the Holocaust. We've had school shootings. We've had, I can go on, unjust wars over boundary lines, maybe. We see in this world tribulation. We see in this world injustice, oppression. And it should frustrate us. It should frustrate us because we know that this stuff shouldn't be. God didn't plan it to be this way. Yet this is what it's like being trapped in time. And we long, our heart longs for eternity. And that's interesting. He does have a solution in verse 17. He says, I said to myself, God will bring into judgment both the righteous and the wicked, for there will be a time for every activity, a time to judge every deed. So his hope is, even though he's trapped in time, he believes God at one day is going to cause justice to reign or flow like a river. That's what he's hoping for, although it's frustrating to him because he can't see the day. Can you empathize with his frustration? Looking at the injustices of the world and saying, I know God one day will set it right, but why couldn't that be today? I know one day God's going to bring into judgment, but why couldn't that be today? Why doesn't it happen now? The teacher in verse 18 says, I also said to myself, as for human, God tests them so that they may see that they are like the animals. Surely the fate of the human being is like that of the animal. The same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so dies the other. All have the same breath. Humans have no advantage over animals. Everything is meaningless. And that's the pessimistic outlook of the teacher. He looks at wickedness and suffering in the world, and he says, I know God one day is going to bring it to an end, but I don't know when. And he's frustrated with that thought. But now he says, well, maybe God allows this to happen to show us that we're just like animals. And I got to tell you, you're not just like animals. Now, see, we have the imago Dei in us. We're created in the image of God. That's not just like animals. God created one idol, that was man. And we were supposed to live in his image. And when we allow injustice to sit where justice is supposed to sit, what's happening is we are acting more like the animals than we are like the God who created us. And that's what's frustrating about it. Because God shows us through our wicked acts that you're just like them. By the way, it's not just whenever we have this humanistic perspective that devalues life and where wickedness begins to reign and shows us that we're just like the animals. When we make ourselves God, we also begin to act just like the animals. Right? You might think of the story of Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar, who looked out from everything he made and he said, I'm just like, look at all the good I've done. He wanted everybody to bow down to him as God, and God turned him into the mind of an animal. Like turned his mind into that mind of an animal. For 7 years, he had to live like an animal because he needed to be reminded that if you don't believe that there is something that transcends the sun, then wickedness is going to reign where justice is supposed to. And if you allow that to happen, you are looking and acting just like the animals. And guess what? Animals die and you share a common fate with them. And so he says that from dust to dust, right? Famous verses of Ecclesiastes, verse 19. Surely the same fate of human beings is like that of the animals. The same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so the other. All have the same breath. Humans have no advantage over the animals. Everything is meaningless. And if your perspective is only what is under the sun, without any view of God, then you are no different than the animals. You're just not. And I know that that's difficult, especially in our time. But that's why I picked this book, because I think our time deals with these issues. right? Our time is a time that we only value the physical in much of our culture. And what happens when you only value the physical, only consider what you can see, hear, touch, taste, smell? Well, now you're classified just along with the animals, maybe just more highly evolved than the rest. But the truth is, we're not. We're created in the image of God. Verse 21, we see the problem with the perspective of the teacher. He says, who knows if a human spirit rises upward and if the spirit of the animal goes down to the earth? Another agnostic statement saying, I don't know what happens after time. If you followed this Solomon's thought up to this point, he's been frustrated because he sees himself locked in time, but he has eternity in his heart, and he wants something better, but he can't grasp it. And so he settles with the unknown. But I have an answer for him, because we know who knows whether or not the spirit of a man rises up. We have one greater than Solomon who says, I am the resurrection and the life. And so all of you know. And by the way, doesn't that make you feel so proud of yourself? You're smarter than Solomon. Solomon didn't know. You're smarter than Solomon. Anyways, the last passage, verse 22, he says, so I saw there was nothing better for a person than to enjoy their work because this is their lot. And I guess if that's your view, there's nothing better than to just enjoy your life today. But Christians live with the kingdom perspective. Christians understand that we need to seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and the things that we need, God is going to make sure that we have. But the best we can do is better than just enjoying our work, although I think you should enjoy your work. The best we could do is lay our life down. So he asks one more question. For what can bring them to see what happens after them? And can you answer his questions, all of you who are greater than Solomon? Or not greater, maybe I should say more wise than Solomon. Jesus is the one. Like Jesus is the answer to so many of the questions in the book of Ecclesiastes. And we find ourselves frustrated with it because we know those answers. And we want to read Ecclesiastes with the New Testament perspective, and that's great. But take a second just to see why he's struggling. Because he doesn't have the same answers that we have had revealed to us. And so he sees himself trapped in time with eternity in his heart, grasping for something that he can't understand. And when he sees wickedness in the world, he says it just shows us that all we are is just like the animals, maybe. But you instead were created in the image of God. And you have a God that transcends time and freed us from its shackles by sending his son and going to the cross. We're going to sing.